Okay, welcome back. We're talking tonight about we'll be doing our fourth installment, right, already? Our fourth installment is it's about the human person, right? The human person and the fall. We've entitled it Communion's Obstacles. We've already talked about last time about the fact that creation was created good, right? It was created by God. Everything in creation was good. There was only one thing in creation that wasn't good that we had talked about, and that's the fact that the man was alone. And Leslie had asked one of the questions about that regard last time about, what does that mean? What does that mean with regard to the meaning of femininity, right? What does it mean with regard to God? And we talked about the fact that what this shows us, really, it's a lesson for us. Right? It's a lesson for us that God reveals to us that we're made for one another, and especially as man and woman. Right? We're made as man and woman for one another. We're not made to be alone. We're made for communion. But we had talked about also that something happened. Something happened in this good creation. It happened between Adam and Eve and God through the temptation of the devil, through the temptation of Satan. And what this led to was a separation from God. We called it the fall. Right? The fall means that things are not the way that they were intended. Now, creation is still good. Everything in creation is still good. But the problem is that now that we have been separated from God, this original separation from God, where we're not intended to be, and the image of that in Scripture, in the book of Genesis, was that we are east of Eden. Right? We're east of Eden. We're outside of the garden. The garden was this image of harmony between humanity and the rest of creation. We now experience this disharmony. This disharmony is talked about very insightfully by St. Paul. St. Paul's letter to the Romans talks about our experience, and we're going to focus really on what human experience is supposed to be, good, as it was created by God, and what it is now that we do not have what we were supposed to have. This original grace, this original communion with God that allows us to operate the way we were intended. Right? We were made for grace. Human beings were made for grace. And we just don't work the way we were intended without it. And this is what St. Paul's experience of it is. St. Paul says, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. So then it is no longer I that do it, but sin which dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells within me, that is, in my flesh. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin which dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law of sin which dwells within my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And of course, we know the answer to that. We'll be talking about that next time. But St. Paul is talking here about what the tradition calls concupiscence. Concupiscence. Concupiscence means that our body, the things associated primarily with our body, our appetites and our emotions, are still working in one way the way that they were intended, right? Generally, we're not attracted to the trash can. right? We're attracted to good things. And this is very important to recognize. we are always attracted to good things. But we know that the good things that we are attracted to are not always good for us. They're not always good, the greater good. And this is wherein lies the problem. Right? We can always rationalize why we will accept, right, our attractions to some good thing. We are very tempted to rationalize why. Because we have these things called appetites and emotions. Appetites and emotions are very good. Right? Somehow our appetites and our emotions reflect the perfection of God. That's where they come from. Right? Somehow the joy we experience, right, comes from God. God doesn't change. So the joy, the way we experience joy is infinitely different than the way God experiences it. Right? God doesn't change. But anger has to come from God, though God doesn't change, right? And what we experience as anger, right, has to somehow reflect the perfection of God, somehow. We're not going to go in, we don't have time to go into exactly how this does it. One thing I do want to say, though, in the passage that I read, we have to understand what it is that St. Paul is, the metaphors that St. Paul is using with regard to the flesh, right? He talks about the flesh in a way that is very traditional. That doesn't mean that the body, the created body, is good. What he's talking about is the fall, right? He's talking about the fact that after the fall, flesh has been separated from its author, from God. And we know who the ruler of this fallen world is, right? The ruler of this fallen world is Satan. So in this sense, there is this law. The law that he's talking about is this law of temptation, which Satan participates in, right? But it is this inclination toward things that are good, but not good for us. Now, let's talk a little bit about emotions and appetites, because we have many traditions going all the way back, really is, in our written history. We can go back to the Greeks and the Stoics, who first believed that emotions, right, were suspect. We see this idea of Stoicism very much in the Nordic and the cultures of, the British cultures, where suppression of emotions, right, because emotions are not trustworthy, are the cultural norm. Right? We also see in the media, right? This might be a little bit old, but actually I guess it's been living on, but in Star Trek and the ideal of Vulcans, right, where they have progressed to the point that they've completely done away with emotions, except for once every seven years or so. In any case, the point is that we have to avoid making the mistake that emotions or appetites are bad. They're good, and they always operate rightly in one sense, in moving us towards what we can call apparent goods. We just have a task now for figuring out whether apparent goods are authentically good. Let me hold off going down that or finishing that thought for a second, because I want to re-evaluate, if you will, these ideas of emotions. Emotions or appetites are things that we need, right? They're things that we need. One example that I always like to use is the nutritional appetite for food, right? Most of us have experienced illness to the point that we have no appetite. And with this illness, right, we just can't make ourselves eat sometimes, but we know we have to, right? And sometimes we can almost gag trying to eat when our appetite just is not there. Now, if you had never experienced this kind of illness, you would think that's crazy, right? Everybody eats. Everybody, most of us have trouble not eating. Well, many of us. the point is that appetites are good. Apparently, we would not eat, right, without this nutritional appetite. There are many others, right? The emotions that go along with love, right? The emotions that go along with love can help us to overcome other inclinations, like self-preservation, right? Parents will give up their lives for their children, right? For love, for this emotion moves them to be able to do something that intellectually they would want to do, but their other inclinations would keep them from doing. Right? So appetites and emotions are good. They're very important. So what I'd like to do is kind of give us a little model to see how this works. Okay? This model, I call it a snowman model. It's a little mental model. If it's not helpful, then we don't need to use it. But if it is, then great. Now, these are perfect spheres touching each other, resting upon one another. Right? If Dan, our cameraman, were to zoom in, you would see that these were perfect spheres, right? But from where you are, they probably don't look so much. It's important. And again, these are spheres resting upon one another. Think about these three-dimensionally. Each of these spheres represent something within the soul. You never knew that your soul looked like a snowman, did you? You learn something new every day here. What do these spheres represent? The largest sphere on the bottom represents, let's call them the affects, right? The appetites, the emotions, the things that affect us, the things that move us towards goods, right? Or away from evils. The reason that it's the largest sphere is because those are the things that seem to have the greatest weight upon us, right? They're the things that seem to be, they seem to be what drive us. We oftentimes can't say no to them. We'll talk about why that is. So these seems to affect us the most. The next sphere is the intellect, right? How we come to know, how we come to reason. And then the smallest sphere at the top is the will. And there's this shaft running through them. Right? There's a shaft running through them. And what does this shaft represent? Well, the fact is that these perfect spheres are integrated. In this situation, right, the affects are subordinated to the intellect and the will. Right? So the affects do what it is that the intellect and the will tell it to do. Right? For example, there would be a piece of chocolate cake here on this desk. And our affects see that chocolate cake and they say, well, there's some nutritional value there as well as a bit of pleasure. We want that. And the intellect takes that desire of the affects, right, that it's presented to it, and it says, well, no, that will be the fifth piece, right? We no longer need. It's the same piece of cake. It's the same good as it was 4 pieces ago, right? But it no longer is good for us. And the affects then would say, okay, sure, I was just saying, right? We don't, it's still there, but we'll behave. We don't have that experience, right? This is the experience of the way things were intended to be. This is the integration. Now, what keeps these integrated? What keeps us operating the way that we were supposed to? Well, it's not part of human nature. It's not part of human nature at all. It's something that God has given us, which we call grace. Right? Now, whatever image we want to use, grace, we can use an image like a tractor beam or some sort of energy beam, right? That is coming down through this shaft, keeping us working the way that we were intended to be. This is the state of the soul, the state of humanity in original grace before the fall. Everything was working the way that was intended, right? Love, especially, right? What we talked about, the foundation of a relationship, in disinterested love, loving the other for their own sake, doing things, right, for the greater good, doing for the good for the other, for regardless of what it does for us. That was a natural reality. Intellectually, we knew that. And our affects did not get in the way of doing that, of being able to do what it is that we wanted to. Right? Before the fall, this idea that St. Paul talks about, right, of concupiscence, of this feeling of wretchedness, because we can't not do what we otherwise want to do, right? This didn't exist. Right? When we lost this harmony with God, and remember last time we talked about the 4 harmonies, we lose this access to God's very life. We lose this access to grace. And what happens? We become disintegrated. Right? No longer does the affects easily respond to the intellect? Right? That is kind of the image of this that I'm trying to show in this fall. The affects now, the appetites, the emotions, they're on the same level as the intellect. And they say, no, we want that cake. We don't care what you say. You figure out a way to justify it. But we want that cake, and we're not going to stop yelling, right? We're not going to stop pushing you until you give in. And what's the easiest thing to do? There are 2 possibilities. One is to take that energy that the appetite is moving us towards, right, and using that energy for something that's authentically good. And saying, yes, I agree with you, that cake is good, but it's not good for me now. And so I will go take a walk, right? Or I will go pray for somebody while I'm walking. And when we do that, the appetites go, oh boy, I guess he means business, right? So the next time it comes about, the appetite figures, well, let's try it one more time. And if he says no again, the next time it comes about, the appetites and the emotions are going to start to say, well, I think we want it, right? They're going to be much less assertive. Eventually, we will reintegrate. We can reintegrate to a particular natural level where we can say no to ourselves, where we can say no to our appetites. But this is not going to be, our capacity to do this is not going to ever reach the perfection that we need to be able to live with one another in harmony, right? The way that we need to live with one another in love. Now, there's one other aspect of this that I want to mention that I didn't mention going into this. This is the idea of, I said this belongs to the soul. This is really the soul. And the soul we know is immaterial, right? The soul is spiritual. The body is material, right? The body is what we can touch, right? The body is what we can see. One of the things that we have to recognize, and this is another error, besides making the appetites, the emotions, the fall guy for our concupiscence, right, for our fallen inclinations, sometimes in the tradition, we have it going all the way back again to before Christ, right? We call it Gnosticism. And Gnosticism continues to live with us today. What this does is it puts the evil within the body. Because the things associated with the body seem to be the things that we are so tempted with, right? The body seems to be the source of our difficulties. So much so that if we just get out of our bodies, we would be happy. Well, the point is that as human beings, we're not made up of 2 separate things, body and soul. This is very important to realize. The body and the soul are not two separate things. We are one nature with two aspects. This means that the soul, right, is present throughout the body. The soul actually gives the body its existence and its shape and its locomotion. When we see the body, we see the soul. When we touch the body, we touch the soul. The soul helps to make the body sacred in this regard, right? The body is good. So we have to be very careful not to make this mistake that thinks about the body as bad or the body as something that's dispensable. Remember, the body and the soul were never meant to be separated. And in fact, the possibility for the soul to continue to exist without the body is a concession by God, right? Sin comes into the world in death through sin, right? Human beings were not intended to die. It is our rebellion against God that caused death to come into the world. So again, we need to be very cautious not to mistake the dignity and the importance and the significance of the body. We can't understand ourselves and we can't achieve the joy that we're called to be without integrating our body and our soul. And this is really what the task is. Okay, this is really what the task is. We're created by God. We're created good. We're created for good. With the fall, we lost what we needed to make that an easy task, a natural task. It now is it's a great effort. Right? It now takes great effort. It takes us habitually saying no to ourselves. Right? We build these habits, the habits that are called virtues. Right? Virtues coming from the Latin virus, right? That reflect the idea of manliness, fullness of being a man, right? This is what we're called to be, right? Fully alive by fully possessing ourselves. We know very much that we do not experience happiness when we cannot say no to ourselves. Right? That's not authentic freedom. Think about it this way. And we're very susceptible to this in the United States especially, of thinking of freedom as a good in itself, right? Thinking of freedom as an end. That the good is actually just in the choosing. But think about it this way. When we choose in a way that doesn't correspond with who we are, what happens? Well, the next time, the appetites and the emotions say, oh, I got him. I'm not going to shut up until I get my way. Right? And so the next time it's harder to say no. Well, we could have easily said, or much more easily said no to the first time. The next time, it's much more difficult. And the next time after that, soon we have a bad habit. Could even be an addiction. Right? Is that freedom? Well, can anything be called freedom be lost simply by using it? Well, no. If we use our freedom and become enslaved by it, that was not authentic freedom. We might call it something else, libertinism, right? Authentic freedom is not an end. It's a means. It's a means for choosing the good. Right? We cannot love one another if we understand love as total self-gift, right? We cannot love one another the way that we were created for the way that really makes us joyful, where we experience the happiness, right, that we were created for. We cannot experience that without full mastery of ourselves, right? Getting ourselves back. Because if we can't say no to ourselves, then we don't possess that aspect of ourselves to give back to God. Okay. So, where are we? Well, we're east of Eden, right? We have the situation in which that we no longer easily possess ourselves. It is now a task. It's a task that in our environment is very difficult because we're living in a society now that completely has mistaken the idea of freedom. Right? Unfortunately, really, of all the good things that the country we live in, the United States, has given to us, one of the bad things, one of the negative things is a misunderstanding of freedom, as though freedom should be there to be able to choose anything. And with that idea, we're very much susceptible to be leading ourselves to slavery by choosing whichever way our inclinations lead us. Our inclinations are always going to lead us to goods. They're always going to lead us to apparent goods. Only our reason can determine whether or not this apparent good is an authentic good or not. If this is not an authentic good, our reason has to carry the day and not let the will go after just an apparent good. It has to say no, and we have the freedom to do that. And if we give up that freedom to do that by misusing it, we become enslaved to our choices. When we experience that freedom, we need to protect it. We need to protect it very jealously. Because once we give it up, getting it back is very, very hard. In fact, the majority of us, I would say, never achieve that, never are able to get that freedom back.